The crystal chandeliers of the cathedral trembled as the gunshot echoed. But Lorenzo didn't look at the rival gang storming the pews. His eyes were locked on the heavy-set woman in the black and white uniform bleeding out on the marble altar. Isabella, the maid who was supposed to be invisible, had taken the bullet meant for him. As he dropped to his knees, staining his tuxedo in her blood, she reached up with a trembling, calloused hand. What she whispered next shattered the ruthless Mafia don forever. The Bianchi estate, nestled behind towering iron gates in the affluent enclave of Lake Forest, Illinois, was a fortress disguised as a palace. Inside its sprawling, cold stone walls lived Lorenzo Bianchi, the 32-year-old don of the Chicago Syndicate. He was a man carved from ice and violence, having inherited the throne 3 years prior when his father, Carmine, was blown to pieces in his Lincoln Navigator on Rush Street. Lorenzo ruled with a terrifying, quiet calculation. He was striking, with sharp Mediterranean features, pitch-black hair, and eyes the color of a winter storm. He was also entirely unreachable. And then there was Isabella Gallagher. Isabella was 28, an Irish-American girl from the South Side who had taken the job at the estate to pay for her mother's staggering medical bills. Isabella was not a Mafia princess. She was not a glamorous socialite. She was a maid, and a big one at that. While the other girls on the domestic staff were hired for their slender figures and ability to look like ornaments in their tailored French maid uniforms, Isabella was heavily built. She was fat, a word she had long ago accepted without flinching. She had broad shoulders, thick thighs, and a soft, round stomach that pushed against the starched white apron of her uniform, making the fabric strain at the buttons. The other maids, mean-spirited girls with sharp elbows and sharper tongues, snickered behind her back, calling her the estate boulder. But Isabella didn't care. Her size made her invisible in a world of superficial monsters, and in the Bianchi household, invisibility was safety. She kept her head down. She scrubbed the imported Italian marble, polished the mahogany banisters until her knuckles cracked, and found her only solace in the massive industrial kitchen when the rest of the house was asleep. It was during one of these late-night kitchen reprieves that her universe violently collided with Lorenzo's. It was past 2 in the morning on a freezing November Tuesday. Isabella couldn't sleep. The anxiety of her mother's failing health had driven her to the kitchen, where she was vigorously kneading a large mound of focaccia dough. The rhythmic motion of her heavy arms pressing into the flour was therapeutic. She wore a simple grey cotton nightgown, her thick chestnut hair tied up in a messy bun, her face flushed and devoid of makeup. The heavy oak door to the kitchen swung open, and Isabella gasped, dropping the dough. Lorenzo Bianchi stood in the doorway. He was missing his suit jacket. His white Tom Ford dress shirt was soaked in dark, wet crimson on the left side. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were as fierce and unyielding as a cornered predator. "Don Lorenzo," Isabella whispered, instinctively backing away, her large frame bumping against the stainless steel prep table. Lorenzo stumbled forward, clutching his side. "Lock the door," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly command. "Now!" Isabella didn't hesitate. Despite her size, she moved with surprising grace, rushing to the heavy door and throwing the deadbolt. When she turned back, Lorenzo had collapsed into a wooden chair, his head resting on the cold steel of the table, his breath coming in jagged gasps. I need to call Mr. Pendleton," Isabella stammered, referencing Lorenzo's brutal right-hand man, Arthur Pendleton. "No," Lorenzo snapped, wincing in agony. "There's a rat in my crew. Pendleton might be compromised. No doctors. No one." He lifted his head, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers. He truly looked at her for the first time, not as part of the furniture, not as the overweight maid who dusted the library, but as a human being. You, Gallagher, you're the one who takes care of your sick mother, right? You know basic first aid. Isabella's hands were shaking. I'm a maid, sir. I'm not a nurse. Do it, Isabella, he ordered, his voice softening just a fraction, the use of her first name sending a strange jolt through her chest. Swallowing her fear, Isabella rushed to the pantry and retrieved the heavy-duty trauma kit kept for emergencies. She returned to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. I have to take your shirt off, she murmured softly. Lorenzo nodded, his eyes slipping shut. As Isabella's soft, thick, trembling hands unbuttoned his blood-soaked shirt, she felt the hard, scarred planes of his chest. He was beautiful in a terrifying way. When she exposed the wound, a deep, ugly knife slash across his ribs, she inhaled sharply. Clean it, he instructed through gritted teeth. For the next hour, the only sounds in the sprawling, silent mansion were the clinking of medical instruments, Lorenzo's suppressed groans, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Isabella as she worked. Because of her size, Isabella was used to taking up space, to being clumsy in tight corners, but right now her hands were gentle, precise, and profoundly comforting. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, applied butterfly stitches with surprising dexterity, and wrapped his torso in thick white bandages. When she finished, she stood back, wiping her blood-stained hands on her apron. Her chest heaved. Lorenzo opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her. He took in her flushed, round face, the flour dusted on her cheek, the soft, ample curves of her body hidden beneath the oversized nightgown. In a world full of fake, sculpted women who wanted his money and power, Isabella was jarringly, beautifully real. Why did you help me, without running away? Lorenzo asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. Isabella looked down at her scuffed orthopedic shoes. Because you were bleeding, sir, and because nobody deserves to die alone on a kitchen floor. Lorenzo stared at her for a long time. The smell of yeast, rosemary, and copper blood filled the air between them. Don't call me sir, he finally said. Call me Enzo. Over the next few months, a strange, unspoken shift occurred within the cold walls of the Bianchi estate. To the rest of the world, Lorenzo remained the ruthless, untouchable Don of Chicago. He crushed the Irish mob on the west side. He expanded his racketeering operations. But inside the house, the ice was melting specifically for the quiet, heavy-set maid who baked bread in the dead of night. It started with small things. Lorenzo began demanding that only Isabella serve him his morning espresso in his private study. When the other, thinner maids complained, spiteful girls like a blonde named Clara, who openly mocked Isabella's thick waistline, Lorenzo fired them without a second thought. Isabella was terrified of this newfound attention, but she couldn't deny the fluttering in her chest every time she entered his study. One morning in late January, she carried his silver tray into the library. The snow was falling heavily outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lorenzo was seated at his massive mahogany desk, looking exhausted, rubbing his temples. Your espresso, Enzo, Isabella said softly, placing the tray down. She was wearing a new uniform, one that Arthur Pendleton had ordered specifically for her. It was custom-tailored, fitting her large frame perfectly, accentuating her soft curves rather than strangling them. Lorenzo looked up, his eyes immediately dropping to her waist, then back up to her flushed face. "You look beautiful today, Isabella," he said smoothly. Isabella's breath hitched. A heavy blush crept up her neck, coloring her round cheeks. She immediately looked down, her insecurities screaming at her. "Please don't mock me, Enzo." Lorenzo frowned, standing up from his desk. He walked around the heavy wood, stepping into her personal space. He was much taller than her, but Isabella was a substantial woman, and she didn't feel small in his presence. She felt grounded. "Look at me," he commanded softly. When she refused, keeping her eyes glued to the Persian rug, he reached out. His large, rough hand gently cupped her soft, full cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "I do not mock you, Isabella. The women in my world, they are made of plastic and poison. They are starved, hollow things. You are life. You are warm. You are real." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. She had spent her entire life being told she took up too much space, that she needed to shrink to be loved. To have the most powerful, dangerous man in Chicago look at her with such raw hunger and reverence was intoxicating. For a brief, wild second, he leaned in. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and expensive tobacco. His lips hovered inches from hers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the study flew open. Arthur Pendleton, Lorenzo's silver-haired enforcer, strode in, oblivious to the heavy tension in the room. Isabella practically jumped backward, nearly knocking over the espresso tray, her heart pounding frantically. "Don Lorenzo," Arthur said grimly, holding a leather folder. "We have a massive problem. The Russo family from New York. They just took out 3 of our warehouses in the South Loop. It's a declaration of war." Lorenzo's expression hardened instantly. The tender man from a second ago vanished, replaced by the merciless Don. He looked at Isabella, his eyes unreadable. "Leave us, Isabella." She nodded, fleeing the room as fast as her thick legs could carry her, the ghost of his touch burning on her cheek. For the next 2 weeks, the estate was a war zone. Armed guards roamed the halls. Isabella barely saw Lorenzo. The violence in the city was escalating, splashing across the front pages of the Chicago Tribune. The Bianchi family was losing ground to the immensely powerful Russo syndicate. Then the devastating news broke. Isabella was polishing the silver in the dining room when she overheard Arthur Pendleton talking to Lorenzo in the hallway. "It's the only way to stop the bloodshed, Enzo," Arthur was saying, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "Don Russo has agreed to a truce, but only on one condition, an alliance forged in blood." "I'm not marrying that vicious snake," Lorenzo snarled. "You have to," Arthur insisted. "Camilla Russo is his only daughter. Marry her, merge the families, and you become the undisputed king of the East Coast and the Midwest. If you refuse, they will slaughter every man in your crew. You have a duty to the family, Enzo. You cannot let your personal distractions get in the way." Isabella froze. The silver spoon in her hand clattered loudly against the table. In the hallway, the voices stopped. Lorenzo stepped into the doorway of the dining room. He looked at Isabella, standing there in her maid's uniform, her wide, tear-filled eyes staring back at him. The reality of their situation crashed down on her with the weight of an anvil. He was a billionaire Mafia don. She was a fat maid from the South Side who made $10 an hour. There was never going to be a fairy tale for someone who looked like her. "Isabella," Lorenzo started, taking a step toward her, his voice tight with agony. "Congratulations on your engagement, Don Lorenzo," she choked out, her voice cracking. Before he could say another word, She turned and practically ran through the servants' quarters, tears hot and bitter on her cheeks. A month later, the Bianchi estate transformed into a nightmare. Camilla Russo had arrived. She was exactly what a Mafia princess was supposed to be. Tall, ruthlessly thin, with platinum blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and a wardrobe that cost more than Isabella's entire bloodline had ever earned. Camilla moved through the estate like a striking viper, asserting her dominance over the staff, the guards, and especially Lorenzo. From the moment she laid eyes on Isabella, Camilla seemed to sense the lingering, heavy tension between the overweight maid and her fiancé. And she hated it. "You," Camilla snapped one afternoon in the grand foyer. Isabella was on her knees, scrubbing a scuff mark off the imported tile. Isabella slowly stood up, keeping her eyes lowered. "Yes, Miss Russo?" Camilla looked her up and down, a sneer twisting her perfect, cosmetically enhanced face. "Are you the reason the grocery bills are so high in this house? Look at you. You're disgusting. A whale in an apron. Make sure you stay out of my sight during the wedding preparations. If I see your massive shadow in my peripheral vision, I'll have Arthur throw you out on the street." Isabella bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. "Yes, Miss Russo." From the top of the grand staircase, a cold voice rang out. "Camilla." Lorenzo descended the stairs, his face a mask of pure, lethal fury. He wore a charcoal suit, looking like a god of death. He walked past Camilla entirely and stood directly in front of Isabella. "Isabella," Lorenzo said softly, ignoring his bride-to-be. "Go to the kitchen. Have the chef make you whatever you want. Take the rest of the day off." "Enzo!" Camilla shrieked, her face turning red. "You are undermining me in front of the help. Look at her. She's a pig!" Lorenzo turned to Camilla, and the temperature in the room plummeted. He stepped so close to the Mafia princess that she had to crane her neck to look at him. "This is my house, Camilla," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "Isabella has more honor in her little finger than your entire bloodline has in its history. If you ever speak to her like that again, I will call off this wedding and send you back to New York in a pine box. Do you understand me?" Camilla looked terrified, nodding quickly. But as Lorenzo turned and walked away, Isabella caught the look in Camilla's eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was pure, calculating murder. The wedding was set for a Saturday in late April at the massive Holy Name Cathedral downtown. The entire underworld was holding its breath. The merger of the Bianchi and Russo families would create an unstoppable empire. 2 days before the wedding, Isabella was tasked with cleaning the master guest suite where Camilla was staying. Camilla was out at a dress fitting. Isabella moved methodically, dusting the vanity, ignoring the expensive diamond necklaces carelessly thrown on the dresser. As she reached to empty the small wastebasket near the bed, something metallic caught her eye. It was a small black burner phone, wedged between the mattress and the bed frame. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. In the Mafia world, a burner phone hidden in a mattress meant only one thing: betrayal. Her hands trembling, she pulled the phone out. It was unlocked. She opened the messages. There was only one contact saved: the architect. Isabella read the texts, and her blood ran ice cold. The architect. "Are the men in position inside the cathedral?" Camilla. "Yes, disguised as the choir and the ushers. 10 men total." The architect. "Good. Once he says, 'I do,' the alliance is legally and symbolically complete. As soon as the priest pronounces them, take him out." Headshots only. With Bianchi dead, my father takes over his territory, and you become the grieving widow in control of Chicago. Camilla. Make sure the fat maid is working the reception. I want to shoot her myself. Isabella dropped the phone on the bed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The entire wedding was a trap. The Russos never intended to share power. They were going to assassinate Lorenzo at the altar the moment the marriage was legitimate, seizing his empire. She had to warn him. Isabella shoved the burner phone deep into the pocket of her apron and ran. She bolted down the grand staircase, her heavy footsteps echoing through the house. She pushed past guards and servants, tears streaming down her face until she reached Lorenzo's study. She threw the doors open. Lorenzo was standing at his desk, surrounded by Arthur Pendleton and 5 other capos. They were poring over maps of the city, tension radiating from them. Lorenzo looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes prominent. He looked up, startled by the intrusion. "Isabella?" Lorenzo said, stepping forward. "What is it?" "Enzo, you can't marry her," Isabella gasped, clutching her chest, struggling to catch her breath. "It's a trap. The Russos. They're going to kill you at the cathedral. I found—" "Enough!" Arthur Pendleton roared, stepping between Isabella and Lorenzo. "Are you out of your mind, girl? Interrupting a syndicate meeting with your hysterical nonsense?" "I have proof," Isabella cried, reaching into her apron pocket for the phone. But her pocket was empty. Panic seized her. She dug her fingers in frantically, but there was a large tear in the lining of the cheap uniform pocket. The heavy burner phone must have fallen out while she was running down the marble stairs. I had a phone," Isabella stammered, looking desperately at Lorenzo. "Camilla's phone. She's conspiring with her father. They have men disguised as the choir. Please, Enzo, you have to believe me," Arthur sneered, looking at Lorenzo. "Enzo, this is pathetic. She's a jealous, overweight maid who has developed a delusional crush on her boss. She's making up fairy tales to stop a wedding because she thinks she has a chance with you." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She flinched, looking at Lorenzo. She needed him to see her, to trust her. Lorenzo stared at her. The weight of the impending merger, the threat of a war that would kill hundreds of his men, and the crushing pressure of his crown were suffocating him. He looked at Isabella's empty hands, her frantic face. He wanted to believe her, but to accuse the Russos of betrayal without proof hours before the wedding meant instant, catastrophic war. "Arthur, leave us," Lorenzo said quietly. The men filed out, leaving Lorenzo and Isabella alone. Lorenzo walked up to her. He gently took her trembling, empty hands in his. "Isabella," he said, his voice breaking. "I know this is hard. I know what is between us. But I am a Don. I carry the lives of 1,000 men on my back. I cannot start a war based on a missing phone." "Enzo, they are going to kill you," she sobbed, tears spilling over her round cheeks. He reached up, wiping a tear away with his thumb. "I will triple my security at the cathedral. But I have to walk down that aisle. For my family. For Chicago." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "When this is over, when the ink is dry and my power is secure, I will find a way to take care of you. I promise." "I don't want to be taken care of," Isabella whispered brokenly. "I want you to live." Lorenzo stepped back, putting his mask of ice back on. "Go home, Isabella. Do not come to the cathedral tomorrow. I don't want you anywhere near this." But Isabella knew, with a horrifying certainty, that if Lorenzo walked into that church, he was a dead man. and she would rather die herself than let the only man who had ever truly looked at her be slaughtered. Saturday morning broke over Chicago in a wash of slate-grey clouds, threatening rain. Inside her cramped second-story apartment on the south side, Isabella Gallagher stood before her cracked bathroom mirror. In the next room, the rhythmic, wet cough of her ailing mother rattled through the thin walls. Isabella gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, her knuckles turning white. Lorenzo had ordered her to stay away. He had commanded her to hide. But as Isabella stared at her reflection, at her broad shoulders, her round, flushed cheeks, and the thick, sturdy frame that had always made her feel like an outcast, a fierce, terrifying resolve settled into her bones. Lorenzo Bianchi was a man who commanded an army of killers, but he was walking blindfolded into a slaughterhouse. He didn't believe her. He thought she was just a jealous, overweight maid, spinning desperate lies to stop a wedding. But Isabella knew the truth. She had read those texts, and as she splashed cold water on her face, she made a decision that would alter the course of Chicago's underworld forever. She was not going to let the only man who had ever looked at her with genuine reverence die on the cold stone of a cathedral floor. She stripped off her civilian clothes and pulled on her black and white estate uniform. The starched white apron strained against her soft stomach, the fabric pulling tight across her heavy chest. It was the uniform of a ghost, a servant meant to blend into the wallpaper. Today, it was her armor. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, State Street was entirely locked down. The Holy Name Cathedral, a towering Gothic masterpiece of stone and stained glass, was surrounded by black SUVs and an army of men in tailored suits. The merger of the Bianchi and Russo families was the criminal event of the decade. The air was thick with tension, expensive cologne, and the silent threat of violence. Isabella knew she could never walk through the front doors. Instead, she navigated the alleyways behind the cathedral, approaching the service entrance used by the elite catering company hired for the reception. She pulled her Bianchi estate ID badge from her pocket, pinning it to her chest. "Hey, you can't be back here," a gruff voice barked. A massive man with a bulging shoulder holster stepped out from the shadows of the loading dock. Isabella forced her heart to stop hammering. She squared her broad shoulders, using her imposing size to her advantage. "I am the head domestic supervisor for Don Lorenzo," she lied, her voice steady and loud. Camilla Russo spilled champagne on her veil in the bridal suite. "I was sent to retrieve the emergency steamer from the estate. If I don't get inside in 2 minutes, the Don will personally mount your head on his hood ornament." The guard hesitated, his eyes darting over her official badge and the sheer, unquestionable authority radiating from her heavy frame. In the Mafia, you didn't question an angry woman running errands for the Don's bride. He stepped aside. "Service stairs to the left. Don't wander." Isabella slipped inside. The underbelly of the cathedral was a maze of stone corridors, smelling of ancient incense and beeswax. Isabella crept up the spiraling service stairs, emerging near the alcoves just behind the main altar. She peeked around a massive marble pillar, and her breath caught in her throat. The sanctuary was breathtaking. Sunlight poured through the immense stained glass windows, casting blood-red and sapphire shadows across the pews. The church was packed with the most dangerous men in America. On the left sat the Chicago Syndicate, Lorenzo's loyal capos, soldiers, and lieutenants. On the right sat the New York faction, Don Russo's men, their eyes cold and calculating. And there, standing at the altar, was Lorenzo. He wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, coal black, fitting his broad, muscular frame perfectly. But as Isabella watched him from the shadows, she saw the subtle tension in his jaw, the deadness in his storm-grey eyes. He looked like a king standing at the gallows, resigning himself to the noose for the sake of his people. To his right stood Arthur Pendleton, the silver-haired enforcer, looking exceptionally calm. Suddenly, the massive pipe organ roared to life, shaking the very foundations of the cathedral. The doors at the back of the nave swung open. Camilla Russo began her march down the aisle. She was a chilling vision in a $100,000 Vera Wang gown, draped in imported lace and diamonds that caught the cathedral light. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly coiffed under a cascading veil. But it was her smile that made Isabella's blood run cold. It was a predator's smile. It was the smirk of a black widow who was about to devour her mate. As Camilla reached the altar, Lorenzo didn't smile. He offered his arm, his movements stiff and mechanical. Isabella's eyes frantically scanned the altar. The choir, the text message had said. 10 men total. She looked up at the choir loft, but it was empty. Panic flared in her chest. Where were they? She scanned the sanctuary again, her gaze dropping to the row of men standing just behind the altar rail. The ushers and the altar servers, dressed in long red and white vestments. Isabella's heart plummeted into her stomach. One of the altar servers shifted his weight, and the heavy fabric of his robe parted just enough to reveal the matte black barrel of a suppressed submachine gun strapped to his thigh. They weren't in the loft. They were right on the altar, only 20 feet from Lorenzo. She had to do something. She had to scream, to pull the fire alarm, to cause a distraction. But as she gripped the edge of the marble pillar, ready to step out, she saw something that froze the blood in her veins. Arthur Pendleton, Lorenzo's most trusted advisor, the man who had ordered this wedding to take place, slowly reached into his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out his phone. He didn't look at Lorenzo. He looked directly at the leader of the fake altar servers. Arthur gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The pieces slammed together in Isabella's mind with sickening clarity. The architect. Camilla's text wasn't to her father in New York. It was to Arthur. Arthur was betraying Lorenzo. He was orchestrating the assassination to take over the Chicago syndicate with the Russos' backing. Lorenzo wasn't just walking into a trap. He had been led there by his best friend. Tears of pure terror blurred Isabella's vision. She was a maid. A fat, invisible girl with no weapon, no power, and no voice. But as she looked at Lorenzo, remembering the way his rough hand had gently cupped her cheek, the way he had defended her honor against Camilla's venom, she knew she was the only shield he had left. The Archbishop of Chicago stood before the couple, his voice echoing through the cavernous space in a rhythmic, hypnotic Latin chant. The cathedral was dead silent, save for the Archbishop's words and the ambient rustle of silk and wool from the hundreds of mobsters filling the pews. Isabella crept closer, abandoning the safety of the corridor, moving silently from pillar to pillar along the side aisle. She was now parallel with the altar, hidden only by a shadow cast by a statue of St. Jude. She was sweating profusely, her heavy breathing echoing deafeningly in her own ears. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God," the Archbishop boomed in English, switching to the native tongue for the vows, "to unite Lorenzo Bianchi and Camilla Russo in holy matrimony." Isabella watched the fake altar servers. There were 6 of them flanking the Archbishop. They were slowly, methodically, unfastening the hidden clasps of their vestments. Their hands were inching toward the concealed weapons, They were waiting for the signal. Once he says, "I do," the alliance is legally and symbolically complete. As soon as the priest pronounces them, take him out. "Lorenzo," the archbishop said, turning to the Don, "do you take Camilla to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part." Lorenzo stared straight ahead. He didn't look at Camilla. He looked at the massive crucifix hanging above the altar. For a fleeting second, Isabella saw a flash of profound sorrow in his eyes. He was sacrificing his soul to save his men. "I do," Lorenzo said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any warmth. Camilla's smile widened. It was terrifying. "And do you, Camilla, take Lorenzo to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the archbishop asked. Isabella's eyes darted to Arthur Pendleton. The silver-haired traitor took a slow, calculated step backward, moving out of the line of fire, distancing himself from Lorenzo. "I do," Camilla purred loudly, her voice practically dripping with anticipation. "Then by the power vested in me, by God and the Holy Church." The archbishop raised his hands, the golden sleeves of his robes catching the light. Isabella's mind went entirely blank. Fear evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. She didn't think about her weight. She didn't think about the guns. She only thought of Lorenzo's life. "I now pronounce you." The fake altar servers drew their weapons. 6 suppressed submachine guns cleared their holsters in terrifying unison. Isabella exploded from the shadows. "Enzo! No!" Her scream was a guttural, shattering sound that ripped through the sacred silence of the cathedral like a bomb. Lorenzo's head snapped toward the sound. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to an agonizing crawl. He saw her. He saw Isabella, wearing her black and white maid's uniform, her face pale with terror, sprinting across the polished marble altar, with a speed and ferocity that defied her size. Camilla shrieked, stumbling backward. The archbishop dropped his Bible. Arthur Pendleton's eyes widened in sheer shock. "Shoot him!" Arthur roared, completely abandoning his cover. The lead assassin raised his weapon, leveling the barrel directly at Lorenzo's chest. Lorenzo reached for the pistol holstered beneath his tuxedo jacket, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. He was entirely exposed. But Isabella was already there. Using the full force and momentum of her heavy frame, Isabella hurled herself between Lorenzo and the firing squad. Her broad back, the very body she had spent a lifetime hiding and despising, became an impenetrable wall of flesh and devotion. Thwack! 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 The suppressed bullets sounded like a staple gun, but the impact was devastating. Isabella felt a series of massive burning punches slam into her back. The first bullet shattered her shoulder blade. The second tore through her side. The third, the fatal shot meant for Lorenzo's heart, struck her dead center in the spine. The sheer kinetic force of the bullets and her own momentum sent her crashing heavily into Lorenzo. The Don grunted as her massive weight hit him, wrapping his strong arms around her thick waist to keep them both from falling, twisting his body to shield her as chaos erupted. "Isabella!" Lorenzo roared, a sound of absolute, unhinged terror that no one in the syndicate had ever heard him make. The cathedral instantly exploded into a war zone. Lorenzo's loyal men in the left pews, seeing Arthur's betrayal and the armed assassins on the altar, drew their weapons. The Russo men on the right returned fire. The deafening roar of unsilenced handguns and automatic fire shattered the stained glass windows, raining colorful glass down on the screaming, stampeding wedding guests. But Lorenzo didn't draw his gun. He dropped to his knees on the white marble steps of the altar, taking Isabella with him. He cradled her heavy, bleeding body in his lap, oblivious to the bullets chewing up the wooden pews and stone pillars around them. Blood, dark and thick, was already soaking through the crisp white apron of her uniform, pooling onto the pristine marble floor. "No, no, no, mio Dio, no," Lorenzo chanted, his voice cracking. He pressed his large, trembling hands frantically against her back, trying to stem the massive flow of blood. His charcoal tuxedo was instantly stained crimson. Isabella's head lolled back against his arm. Her round face, usually so flushed and full of life, was rapidly draining of color, turning a terrifying ashen gray. She gasped for air, a wet, rattling sound echoing in her throat. "Enzo," she whispered, her eyes fluttering. "I'm here. I'm right here," Lorenzo sobbed. The ruthless Mafia Don, a man who had tortured rivals without blinking, was weeping openly, tears falling onto her pale cheeks. "Medic! I need a medic up here now!" he screamed over the deafening gunfire. But his men were pinned down, fighting for their lives against Arthur's traitors. Camilla Russo was crawling frantically away toward the sacristy, her $100,000 dress ruined with dirt and blood. Lorenzo didn't even look at her. His entire universe was localized to the heavy, dying woman in his arms. I told you," Isabella managed to smile, a weak, trembling lifting of her lips. She reached up with a heavy, blood-stained hand. Lorenzo caught her hand, pressing her palm against his cheek, leaning into her touch just as he had done in his study. "You did. You warned me. You beautiful, brave girl. You saved me." "The phone," she coughed, a thin line of blood spilling over her lip. "Arthur. He was the architect." "I know," Lorenzo vowed, his grey eyes flashing with a murderous, demonic light before softening completely as he looked back at her. "I'll kill him. I'll kill them all. Just stay with me, Isabella. Please. Do not leave me." Isabella's breathing was growing incredibly shallow. The pain in her back was fading, replaced by a creeping, icy numbness that was slowly swallowing her whole. She looked up at his handsome face, committing every sharp angle, every storm-grey fleck in his eyes to memory. "I am just a maid," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crack of gunfire. "You are my queen," Lorenzo choked out, pressing his lips desperately to her forehead. "You are everything. Hold on." Isabella's thick, calloused hand slipped from his cheek, falling limply to the marble floor. Her eyes, fixed on his face, slowly lost their focus, drifting away into a blank, unseeing stare. The heavy, calloused hand that had once kneaded bread in the quiet hours of the night slipped from Lorenzo's cheek and hit the cold marble with a sickening, hollow thud. For Lorenzo Bianchi, time stopped. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire, the shattering of the cathedral's priceless, stained-glass windows, the screaming of the fleeing elite, all of it faded into a muted, underwater hum. He stared down at Isabella's face. The vibrant, flushed cheeks he had come to adore were now the color of wet ash. Her broad, soft chest, which had just absorbed 3 hollow-point rounds meant for him, was completely still. She wasn't breathing. A sound tore from Lorenzo's throat, a guttural, jagged roar of pure agony that didn't sound human. It was the sound of a man's soul being ripped from his body. He gently, almost reverently, laid Isabella's heavy frame down on the blood-slicked steps of the altar. He pressed a kiss to her cooling forehead, smearing his own blood onto her pale skin. When Lorenzo stood up, the grieving man was gone. In his place was the devil of Chicago. He didn't seek cover. He didn't check to see if his loyal capos were winning the firefight. Lorenzo bent down and picked up an M4 carbine dropped by one of the dead fake altar servers. He racked the charging handle, his storm-grey eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy. 20 yards away, near the baptismal font, Arthur Pendleton was screaming orders at the remaining Russo men, desperately trying to secure the exits. Arthur turned, expecting to see Lorenzo dead. Instead, he saw the Don walking straight through the crossfire, seemingly untouched by the bullets whizzing past him, his eyes locked onto Arthur with the intensity of a laser. "Take him down!" Arthur shrieked, shoving one of the Russo soldiers forward. Lorenzo raised the carbine and fired. 3 precise, ruthless bursts tore through the remaining assassins in the center aisle. He didn't break his stride. He stepped over the splintered mahogany of the pews, a terrifying force of nature draped in a blood-soaked tuxedo. Arthur panicked. He dropped his weapon and turned to run toward the heavy oak doors of the sacristy. He didn't make it. Lorenzo dropped the empty carbine, drew his custom Sig Sauer P226, and fired a single shot. The bullet shattered Arthur's right kneecap. The silver-haired enforcer let out a high-pitched scream, collapsing onto the mosaic floor. The firefight in the cathedral was abruptly dying down. Lorenzo's loyal men, fueled by the sheer, terrifying rage of their Don, had overwhelmed the Russo faction. The surviving traitors were on their knees with guns pressed to the backs of their heads. Lorenzo stood over Arthur. The older man was clutching his shattered knee, weeping in agony. "Enzo, please," Arthur begged, his aristocratic face pale with shock. "The Russos promised me the Midwest. I had to do it. It was just business. She was just a maid, a nobody." Lorenzo's expression didn't change. He pressed the hot barrel of the Sig Sauer directly against Arthur's forehead. "She was my world," Lorenzo whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, icy calm. "And you took her from me." He pulled the trigger. Without looking at the body, Lorenzo turned his back and sprinted to the altar. The heavy wooden doors of the cathedral burst open, and paramedics from the Chicago Fire Department swarmed in, flanked by heavily armed police officers who were instantly frozen by the sight of the massacre. "Here!" Lorenzo roared, dropping to his knees beside Isabella again. "Get over here now!" 2 seasoned paramedics rushed forward with a trauma bag and a stretcher. They took one look at Isabella's size, the amount of blood pooling beneath her, and the gunshot wounds to her back. "Sir, you need to step back," the lead paramedic said, pressing a gauze pad to her spine. "She has no pulse. We need to intubate and push epi." "Do not let her die," Lorenzo growled, grabbing the paramedic by the collar of his uniform, his grey eyes wild and bloodshot. "I own the board of directors at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. You bring her back, or I will burn this entire city to the ground. Do you understand me?" "We're doing everything we can, man," the paramedic shouted back, slamming his hands onto Isabella's chest to begin heavy compressions. Because of her thick frame, he had to push with all his body weight to reach her heart. 1, 2, 3. "Come on, stay with us." They managed to stabilize a faint, thready heartbeat, just long enough to load her onto the reinforced stretcher. Lorenzo refused to let go of her hand. He climbed into the back of the ambulance, ignoring the chaos, the police, and his crumbling empire. As the siren wailed, echoing through the canyon of skyscrapers on State Street, Lorenzo pressed Isabella's cold, heavy fingers to his lips, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The VIP surgical waiting room on the top floor of Northwestern Memorial Hospital was a sterile, silent purgatory. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. Lorenzo had been sitting in the same leather chair for 11 hours. He had refused a change of clothes. His tuxedo was stiff and brown with Isabella's dried blood. His capos had secured the entire floor, standing like statues in the hallways. But Lorenzo didn't care about syndicate business. He had already given the order. Camilla Russo had been captured trying to flee out of O'Hare International Airport. She was being held in a warehouse until Lorenzo decided her fate. Her father, Don Russo, had been executed in a retaliatory strike in Manhattan 3 hours ago. The war was already won, but none of it mattered if the heavy wooden doors of Operating Room 4 didn't open with good news. Finally, just past midnight, Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the chief of trauma surgery, walked through the double doors. He looked exhausted, his blue scrubs stained, pulling off his surgical cap. Lorenzo was on his feet instantly, his heart slamming against his ribs. He couldn't speak. The most powerful man in the Midwest was terrified. Dr. Hayes let out a long, heavy exhale. "She is alive, Don Lorenzo." Lorenzo collapsed back against the wall, burying his face in his blood-stained hands as a ragged, tearless sob ripped out of him. "But I need you to understand something," Dr. Hayes continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a serious murmur. "It is an absolute medical miracle that she is breathing. She took 3 high-caliber rounds to the back at point-blank range. 1 shattered her scapula, 1 punctured her lung. The third—" The doctor shook his head in disbelief. "The third was a direct hit to the L4 vertebrae. It should have severed her spinal cord entirely. She should be paralyzed or dead." Lorenzo looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Why isn't she?" Dr. Hayes offered a small, weary smile. "Because of her body type. The sheer density of her back muscles and the thick layer of adipose tissue, her body fat, acted as a biological decelerator. It absorbed the massive kinetic shock of the bullet, slowing it down just enough so that it lodged a millimeter away from the spinal canal instead of ripping through it. Mr. Bianchi, the very weight she likely carries as a burden is exactly what served as her armor today. Her size saved her life." Lorenzo closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of profound, crashing emotion. The women of his world starved themselves to fit an impossible mold of perfection, and their fragility would have killed them on that altar. Isabella was real. She was substantial, and her beautiful, soft, heavy body had shielded them both. "Can I see her?" Lorenzo rasped. "She is in a medically induced coma in the intensive care unit," Dr. Hayes said softly. "She won't wake up for a few days. But yes, you can sit with her and sit." For 4 days, Lorenzo did not leave her bedside. He brought in his own private security to guard the ICU doors. He had Isabella's ailing mother transferred via private medevac helicopter to a private suite 3 floors down, personally paying for the finest oncologists in the country to take over her care. He bathed Isabella's forehead with a cool sponge. He held her large, soft hand. He talked to her in the quiet hours of the night, telling her about his childhood, his fears, and a future he suddenly wanted to live to see. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor hitched. Lorenzo looked up from the paperwork he was signing on his lap. Isabella's eyelashes fluttered, her brow furrowed in pain, and slowly her brown eyes blinked open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. She looked confused, her gaze darting around the room, taking in the IV lines and the pristine white sheets. Then she turned her head and saw him. Lorenzo was beside her in a second, his hands hovering over her, as if she were made of glass. "Isabella," he breathed, his voice thick with tears. "You're awake. Mio Dio, you're here." Isabella tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She swallowed hard, wincing as the movement pulled at the stitches in her chest. "Enzo," she rasped weakly. Are you hurt?" Lorenzo let out a wet, choked laugh, resting his forehead gently against the edge of her pillow. "You took 3 bullets for me, and the first thing you ask is if I'm hurt? No, Isabella. I'm safe. Because of you." "The wedding," she mumbled, panic flashing in her eyes as the memories came rushing back. "Arthur, the guns." "It's over," Lorenzo said firmly, lifting his head to look directly into her eyes. He gently brushed a stray lock of chestnut hair from her cheek. "Arthur is dead. The Russo family is dismantled. There is no wedding, and there never will be. The only thing that matters in this entire world is right here in this bed." Isabella looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. She felt the heavy bandages wrapping her broad torso. She felt the familiar weight of her body against the mattress. "I ruined everything," she whispered, a tear slipping down her flushed cheek. "I made a mess on the altar. I'm just the fat maid, Enzo. You're a king. You shouldn't be here." Lorenzo's face hardened, but not with anger. It was a fierce, protective devotion. He leaned down, his lips hovering an inch from hers. "Listen to me very carefully, Isabella Gallagher," he commanded softly, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. "The doctor told me what happened. Your body, this beautiful, soft, perfect body that you hide beneath an apron, stopped a bullet from severing your spine. You didn't ruin everything. You saved my life. You're the bravest person I have ever known." Isabella sobbed quietly, the emotional dam finally breaking. "My mum is 3 floors down, receiving the best care money can buy," Lorenzo interrupted smoothly. "You will never work another day in your life. You will never wear a uniform again. You will never hide in a kitchen." He reached into the pocket of his trousers. He pulled out a massive, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring. A family heirloom that belonged to his grandmother, completely different from the gaudy, ostentatious ring he had bought for Camilla. "I am a dark man." "Isabella," Lorenzo whispered, sliding the ring onto her thick, calloused ring finger. It fit perfectly. "I live in the shadows. But you are my light. You are my home. Marry me. Be the Queen of Chicago. Let me spend the rest of my life worshipping the woman who saved my soul." Isabella looked at the diamond glittering on her finger, and then up at the ruthless Mafia Don, who was currently on his knees beside her hospital bed, looking at her as if she were the only woman on earth. She didn't need to shrink to fit into his world. She was exactly the right size to rule it. "Okay, Enzo," she whispered, a radiant, tearful smile spreading across her round face. "I'll be your queen." Lorenzo leaned down and finally captured her lips in a deep, desperate kiss, sealing a vow that no bullet, no rival family, and no superficial judgment could ever break. Isabella's incredible journey from an invisible, bullied maid to the undisputed queen of the Chicago syndicate proves that true strength doesn't come in a perfect, sculpted package. Her soft, heavy frame, the very thing society told her to hide, was literally the armor that saved the life of the most dangerous man in the city. Lorenzo didn't love her despite her size. He worshipped her because of the real, substantial, fiercely loyal woman she was. Did this intense mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved Isabella's bravery and Lorenzo's ruthless devotion, hit that like button and subscribe for more heart-stopping drama.